The next presentation is titled A Paradigm Shift in Investing. And the speaker is Ms. Karniol-Tambour, Co-Chief Investment Officer for Sustainability at Bridgewater Associates. Let me introduce to you the speaker, Ms. Karniol-Tambour. She is the co-CIO for Sustainability at Bridgewater Associates of the United States, which is the largest hedge fund in the world. After receiving her AB from Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs, she joined Bridgewater in 2006. She's been engaged in integrated analysis of the global market, investment logic, and construction of portfolio. She was also head of research, and currently, as the CIO, she leads the design and oversight of new investment solutions with both financial and sustainability objectives. She is a member of the Executive Committee and Investment Committee of Bridgewater. She is also a partner, and she has been named to Barron's list of most influential women in U.S. finance for 3 years in a row since 2020. She has sent us a video message. Enjoy.
It's an honor to be with you today and speak about sustainable investing and the role that investors can have. What we've seen in recent years is truly a paradigm shift in investing. It's a paradigm shift in how investors see themselves and their goals. What investors have done for decades is pursue through their investments achieving the highest possible return per unit of risk. That remains an extremely important goal of investing, and that'll never change. But what is happening today and represents a paradigm shift is that investors are increasingly realizing that when they put significant amounts of capital to work, that capital has impact on the real world and what kind of sustainability outcomes the real world can achieve. This is leading an increasing number of investors to say that they really have three goals. They would like to pursue the highest possible return for the lowest possible risk, but also think about their impact on the real world or how they impact sustainable development. This is a paradigm shift that requires investors to rethink and really re-engineer their full portfolio. Because now, instead of optimizing for only two things, return and risk, we need to optimize for three different dimensions or invest in three dimensions: risk, return, and impact, and make sure all three of these are not being sacrificed for accomplishing the goal. Now, the first step in doing that is having a measurement of what we mean by impact or sustainability that's anywhere near as good as the measurements we've developed over many decades to ask, what is the return of an asset going to be, or how risky is the asset? Developing that is the first important task of investors who care about sustainable investing. We take a systematic approach to the challenge of assessing the sustainability of assets. By a systematic approach, I mean that we first go out and say, what is our goal? What does sustainability truly mean to us? And to us, it means being aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals can be thought of almost as a business plan for the world economy. It lays out 17 lofty goals ranging from no poverty to tackling climate change, and says that they must be achieved simultaneously. In other words, we can't just tackle climate change and forget the impacts that might have on things like poverty or water access. And at the same time, goes down and says, what are the specific measurements? What are the specific things we must do to achieve these 17 goals? That gives us a map of what we are trying to measure. Then we must build a machine, a systematic process that basically evaluates a large amount of data to ask for every asset whether or not it is aligned to these goals, diversifies across these data sources to triangulate that the sustainability read is right, and then gives an outcome, delivers an answer for how aligned any security is that you might hold with sustainability. Underlying this process is, of course, a sustainability data ecosystem. And sustainability data is an evolving field. Today's data ecosystem is significantly better than what was available 5 years ago. And in 5 years, we will have a much better ecosystem available. For investors today, we are currently able to ingest, process, clean millions of different data sources across tens of thousands of assets and issuers. And the most important thing in building that ecosystem is being clear, what are you trying to measure? In our case, the United Nations SDGs. And at the same time, building sufficient triangulation that messy, confusing, and often contradictory data sources can be put together. The process is no different than what we've done for years as macroeconomic researchers, asking questions like, what will Japanese growth be in the next 3 months? And what has it been the last 3 months? There are many sectors in the economy, different ways to approach the question, and we want to triangulate across many different reads to come to an answer. Doing this systematically allows us over time to assess tens of thousands of companies and assets around the world. In the case of companies, for example, we assess over $60 trillion in public equities to see who is aligned to the UN SDGs and who is not. In the case of a company, we ask two key questions related to the SDGs. One is, what does the company do? What are the products or services that it provides? And are these products or services on our roadmap for achieving the UN SDGs, or actually detrimental from achieving the UN SDGs? The second question is, how does the company produce these products or services? What are all the inputs? How does it treat its labor? What are the emissions it produces along the way? And is that behavior consistent with achieving the SDGs or not? You can see here that for tens of thousands of companies, we can pick systematically who are the ones who are outperforming, who are doing best in terms of both delivering the goods and services we need to achieve the UN SDGs, and doing that with the type of business behavior that will move us forward as well, then who are the ones who are detrimental. Now, that is, of course, a snapshot of today. And investors play a material role when they think in this risk-return impact framework in directing their capital to these leaders shown in these green dots that have really made a difference. And we want to continue funding and giving capital to, making their capital access cheaper to continue us moving us forward toward the SDGs. But there's also a question of companies that are not yet succeeding, but want to move in this direction and want to improve. We also assess this systematically. We ask ourselves, who are the companies that are going to do a great job either shifting their goods and services mix from ones that are not particularly helpful to achieving the SDGs to ones that are more sustainable, or are going to materially improve how they behave? What are the inputs into its behavior that are going to move it towards more sustainability? A good example of this is auto companies. Almost every auto company in the world has laid out lofty goals about how they will move from being a company that makes its money from internal combustion engines that burn oil and contribute to climate change, towards a company that makes electric vehicles and actually can help reduce climate change. While all companies say they will do this, not all will succeed. And as an investor, the question we need to ask is, how confident are we that these companies will actually be improvers on sustainability? Since if we direct capital to them, we are directly funding that expansion or that shift towards more sustainable behavior. So we want to look systematically across multiple data points at issues like, what is the company intent? How committed are they to this? And what's the evidence that they're really going to do it? In other words, have they actually realized any success in moving towards becoming an EV company? And what's the magnitude of their CapEx commitment? How much are they actually retooling their factories and their processes to meet their goals? When investors do this systematically across the ecosystem, they can have a tremendous impact by not only choosing what companies to hold based on risk and return, but within that, finding the companies that are most likely to use the financing they're receiving from investors to either continue expanding their footprint as leaders in sustainability, or to make these sorts of transitions like these auto companies to become more sustainable in the future, which often requires huge, huge investments. Let me step back and say a few more minutes on climate change and how investors impact climate change. Well, it's very important to think about how much will the world warm in different scenarios. For investors, we can't only think about how many degrees warming will occur. We must ask ourselves, how will the world reach a certain degree of warming? Or how will the world stop warming by putting practices in place that will avoid climate change? And we see potential transition pathways that will move us away from the worst damages of climate change, but in different ways that will affect investors differently in terms of the cause-effect linkages that are driving the emissions reduction. I would broadly divide these transition pathways into ones that require sticks, if you will, or disincentivizing the things that we do today we need to move away from, or ones that are more carrots, that make it more attractive to do what we would like to do in the future that is greener. On the stick side, you could imagine putting a price on carbon. Europe has done this. Many other countries have set up an infrastructure to do it to a degree. And what that literally does is takes fossil fuels and makes them less attractive to use because they're more expensive through this tax. Investors have less impact on direct carbon pricing. They're not the government, but investors do have an impact on indirectly creating a carbon price by changing what the cost of capital is for people who extract fossil fuels. More directly, investors can really engineer many of the supply squeezes that we've seen by stopping how many fossil fuels they're willing to get out of the ground. We've seen this most in coal, where investors saying we will not finance new coal coming out of the ground has really squeezed supply in many parts of the world. These are two ways the world can transition. They're somewhat more painful and difficult because they create the sort of supply squeezes on energy that we see today and rising costs like we see today. On the side of the carrots, the government can come in and create fiscal spending, in effect, subsidizing those greener activities that we want to see in order to move towards mitigating climate change. We've seen a very large example of that with Biden's recent Inflation Reduction Act. Through that act, many green activities are being subsidized. Investors, of course, are not governments, and they can't determine the course of government policy, but they do an element that's very similar to that by changing the cost of capital for those providing green activities versus those extracting fossil fuels. Most extremely, the best case for the world is that we get significant green tech breakthroughs, where there's a step change in how cheap it is to capture carbon and how attractive renewable power is relative to fossil fuels. And investors play an important role in subsidizing those activities and funding them and in making sure those things come to market. As you look across all of these perspectives, what you see is that not only do these pathways give investors a better roadmap of how they can influence whether or not mitigating climate change becomes a reality, but also this is an important measure of risk in their portfolio. As an example, when we look at an illustrative global portfolio across these four scenarios, we see very different impacts on a portfolio if climate change is mitigated through tech breakthroughs, through fiscal spending, or through supply squeezes and carbon pricing. The former being very attractive for portfolios, the latter being pretty unattractive for portfolios. Stepping back, we do see a very significant paradigm shift in investing, with investors increasingly looking not only at return and risk, but also at their impact on the world. That requires us to take these concepts of thinking about our impact on the world and be able to measure them systematically in order to be able to actually apply them at scale to large-scale portfolios that have tens of thousands of assets all over the world, and be able to quantify in a systematic way what is our impact and why. The implications of this are both significant to returns of assets, or what assets will do well in the world, to our risk that we're taking, as I showed in that last example of stress testing, and what kind of portfolio losses you would see depending on different scenarios of where the world goes, and most importantly, on the impact that we're having and letting us engineer a portfolio that still meets its risk and return objectives while also meeting these new impact objectives and having an impact on how the world moves towards sustainability goals all at the same time.
Karen Karniol-Tambour 様、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. That was Ms. Karen Karniol-Tambour, the
Sustainable Finance